What a field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street singing songs and they carrying signs, mostly saying hooray for our side. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. When people speak in their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop the children. What's that sound? Everybody look, it's going down.
This is Lauren Steiner. Welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. With me is my guest, Pat Coate. How are you, Pat?
Good. How you doing?
Good. So Pat is Pat the Burner on Twitter.
So I was formerly Peter Douche, who was the parody of Peter Dow, but since he's now on the good team, apparently, I gave that up and turned it into a parody account of Nate Silver called Nate's Liver.
And you also wrote a book. I was going to have you on my show. It was called The Inconvenient Douche. But you have a new book coming out. What's that called and what's that going to be about?
Right. It's about a month away. It's called When Life Gives You Don Lemons. And this one is focused a lot more on the media specifically. So it's, the news pundits, the station, the bias, the think tanks that they have on, all the propaganda, less focused in the last book on the Democratic Party, but more on the just the general ways that we get propagandized as citizens and what to look out for and what to expect coming up.
Well, see, that's why it's good that we have citizen journalism, and I can do a show and you can have a big following on Twitter, and we can kind of counter all the lies and smears on the mainstream corporate media, which we are going to be doing tonight. And I picked out 3 articles that came out today that I thought were especially egregious. And they're coming fast and furious because Bernie is winning in Iowa and New Hampshire. And they're just panicking about what's going to happen. Before we discuss these articles, I just wanted to mention that, no sooner did I go online to read them again and make some notes, which I want to go over here, about the articles in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic. I found a new article that New York Times posted just a few hours ago, and it was titled, "In Iowa, the Not Sanders Democrats Find Voters Torn." And this is interesting because while it concedes that Bernie Sanders has 27% now, it's basically saying that the other candidate, that is a weak plurality, and the other candidates are still going to stay in because they're going to be able to get enough to go on, as long as they get past 15%, they'll have delegates. But what really caught my eye was the writing, the verbiage they used, because now remember, this is not an opinion piece. This is a news article. So the subheading was, and the line that they picked out was, "As the liberal Bernie Sanders tightens his grip in Iowa," and then it goes on, like tightens his grip. And then later on it goes, "Mr. Sanders is threatening to seize control in the early states." And it's like seize control, like he's some sort of right-wing autocrat doing like a coup d'etat. What do you make of this? I mean, they don't even try to hide their disdain and their panic.
Right. And, it is all coup language. You nailed it. I mean, it's them tying him to socialist. It's a grand scale takeover of what was their Democratic Party. And, that's accurate. We are taking over the party, but it's not something that people are against. I mean, that's why we have an election. It's not really a coup when, half the party is going to vote for Bernie. That's the democratic process in play here.
Further in that article, I wanted to point out, they say each of the would-be Stop Sanders candidates has built enough political strength to justify forging ahead. And I think that they really revealed something that we've been saying all along, that we've been suspecting, that the reason they put in 20 plus candidates is to stop Sanders and to see which one of them would stick. I mean, and to use that term, stop Sanders candidates, is even disrespectful to those candidates, because I'd like to think they are in this race for their own reasons. I mean,
Right.
rather than to just stop Sanders.
Right. But if you were to believe the press, he's never been anything we needed to stop until just this last week, because he was not viable. He's not healthy. His movement left him. Kamala is surging. Buttigieg is surging. Klobuchar is going to win this thing. I mean, you can go from one ridiculous argument they've made to the next, but he's had the steadiest support the entire election, and they act like it all just snuck up on him this week.
Yeah. So the other article they had that was really egregious was Bernie Sanders and his internet army. And they start out by saying no other Democrat attracts supporters more dedicated to forcefully defending their candidate and lashing his foes, which is bad. But then they say more willing to repeatedly donate their time and money to sustain his bid. And my point about the first one is we wouldn't have to be defending him if they weren't constantly smearing him. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, look, you've got a candidate with the most supporters, the most donors, the most volunteers, and he's getting treated the worst in the press. That formula is going to have a few people that may cross a line, but even that, I mean, it's a mathematical equation. You got 50 million followers, you're going to get 7 people that are nuts.
Yeah.
But only Bernie has to apologize and be called to account for those 7 people. And, meanwhile, you've got online that ex-Kamala Harris supporters, K-Hive, are some of the most vile people there are online. And nobody talks about them. Nobody ever has. And their attacks on Bernie are 90% hearsay. There's nobody's name to these. Who's getting attacked? Who's getting smeared?
Right.
Who's doing it?
Let's talk about in the body of that article, and speaking of K-Hive, Ian Sams, who was Kamala Harris's communications director, was really one of the worst. I mean, they have a lot of nerve writing multiple articles now about David Sirota, when this guy, Ian Sams, his vitriol was really vicious. So when Mr. Sanders supporters swarm someone online, they often find multiple access points to that person's life, compiling what can amount to investigative dossiers. They will attack all public social media accounts, posting personal insults that might flow in by the hundreds. Some of the missives are direct threats of violence, which can be reported to Twitter or Facebook and taken down. More commonly, there is a barrage of jabs and threats, sometimes framed as jokes. If the target is a woman, and often is, these insults can veer toward her physical appearance. For some perceived Sanders critics, there has been mail sent to home addresses or the home addresses of relatives. The contents were unremarkable. News articles about the political perils of centrism. The message seemed clear. We know where you live. I mean, this is really libelous and slanderous for them to be saying these things without providing what we call receipts. I mean, usually you would have like a hyperlink to something like that, and the person would have to provide an email or a tweet or something like that. But they're just stating this as if these were facts.
Right, and it's absolutely irresponsible for a news organization to do that. I mean, if I worked for, Tom Steyer's campaign and I wanted to make Bernie look bad, I can write a note to someone and put signed Bernie reporter, and that would be in the news tomorrow.
Yeah.
It's look, you need to verify these things, and people need to be on the record, and all they have is hearsay because they don't have any actual opposition research that's going to damn Bernie, and they know it. So this is why we get this whole next week before Iowa. We haven't seen anything yet. By the end of the week, Bernie's going to be a racist, homophobic, you name it. Yeah. According to the press.
That goes into like the other article as far as what David Frum said. And I didn't mean to be skipping around, but I do want to address that point. And that article was Bernie Can't Win. And this was in the Atlantic. And the Atlantic is not known as a Republican publication, but I would certainly call it it toes the neoliberal, neoconservative line,
right.
Which both parties follow. And David Frum, people know him as a speechwriter for George W. Bush. And he also is associated with the National Review, a conservative publication, and the American Enterprise Institute, a conservative think tank. He wrote a book with Richard Pearl. He came up with the term axis of evil as George Bush's speechwriter. And here he is opining that Bernie can't win. Now, he makes some good points, in this article. He talks about all of the attacks that were going to be unleashed on Bernie, that
Yes.
the gloves have been taken off. They haven't come after him. They didn't come after him in 2016. And it's so ridiculous because all these things, and in case you didn't know what those attacks might be, he hands them up to you on a silver platter, even referencing that BS, rape fantasy essay that he wrote. It was a piece of fiction in the early 1970s. I mean, what did you think of that?
You've got a Republican advising the Democrats on who to run and who should lead them against Trump. Well, why do all these shows have stacked pundit decks where, if there are 4 people on the show, 2 of them are ex-Republicans and 2 of them are Hillary supporting Democrats, and maybe they'll have a 5th one that works for, Raytheon, So anyway, but why are we taking advice from David Frum in the first place? Like any Democrat sharing his advice is doing a disservice to our party. But let's get to the bulk of his article. His core point is that in 40 years, Bernie has never faced scrutiny. He's never been targeted with opposition research. He's never been hit as hard as he's going to get hit. Well, that's obviously ridiculous. And to take it back to Peter Dow, who my parody account was about, Peter Douche, well, he is now flipped from the Hillary camp in 2016. And he says he saw all the opposition research on Bernie and that it's nothing. And essentially, there isn't much. And we know this because there is nothing Hillary would have held back in 2016. There's nothing. They would have used everything they possibly had. And all they have left is a Bernie surrogate said something, or a Bernie volunteer or campaign person wrote something mildly critical of Warren. So that's damning to his campaign somehow.
And also, I think his main point is defeated by the fact that he says that Trump is going to use this against Bernie. Well, there's way more that Trump is going to use against Biden and also Elizabeth Warren. And he's used a lot of that stuff against Elizabeth Warren. But it's funny that, David Frum doesn't mention this.
Well, I thought his whole article was strange because he's basically making the argument that Democrats need to run like Bernie Sanders is doing.
Well, that's the good part of his article. Like he starts out by talking about Joe Rogan.
Right.
And, Joe Rogan's rant about Fallon Fox.
Okay, the reason that Joe Rogan gets labeled a transphobe, as far as I know, is mostly that one point about MMA fighters. So we're talking about a brutal contact sport where someone that identified as a woman, or someone that was a man is in the sport fighting as a woman. And Joe Rogan's point, and I don't want to argue if he's right or wrong, but his point is that it's unfair because it's a big advantage. And he brings up bone structure, density, actual physical, it's a brute strength sport. It's not like a lot of sports where it would be less relevant. Okay, that's a debatable issue. The part, which side you come out on that one particular point, that's what's being used against Joe Rogan. And he's in a position of being a comedian with a talk show that discusses these issues a lot. And it's a free-flowing Howard Stern-like show where you debate things openly, and it's a lot of back and forth, and it's not a filtered show.
But regardless, has anyone ever criticized Hillary Clinton for going on, Howard Stern?
Well, and that's a good point right there. But even with Joe Rogan, so Rogan said that all the candidates courted him to be on the show. So Warren's campaign asked him to be on the show. Biden's campaign asked them to be on the show. So obviously they would have taken his support. The idea that they wouldn't have taken the support of a person whose podcast has more views than CNN and MSNBC do every night is ridiculous.
Combined, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and the thing is, first of all, this was not even an endorsement in the sense, he said, I will probably vote
Exactly.
for her. And what Bernie did was he highlighted the reason. And the reason is something that we all agree is the reason that we all support Bernie. And there was nothing wrong with what he said about Bernie. And that's what Bernie was highlighting. Meanwhile, you had Elizabeth Warren had a surrogate by the name of Ashley Marie Preston, who I met. And she's a trans woman here in Los Angeles, seems like a perfectly nice person. But when you look at some of the things that she tweeted about Asians, about gays, about, other minorities, I mean, it was really horrific.
And, it was, and she was given a platform on TYT and didn't a lot of times she didn't explain her position as a surrogate for Elizabeth Warren.
And so, you didn't see any of these pearl clutchers asking Warren to denounce her or, to not make her a surrogate. As far as I know, she still is a surrogate, Right.
Well, to bring it back to the David Frum article and the trans issue, and specifically, he brings up the debate answer that Bernie answered the question poorly compared to Elizabeth Warren about trans. I don't remember the exact question, but if you look at their records, Bernie's record on the issue is worlds ahead of the rest of them. I mean, Warren, she gets criticized a lot for not supporting medical reassignment drugs for prisoners. Biden supported Don't Ask, Don't Tell, voted for DOMA. So you just can't compare these two. Bernie had a trans mecca in Burlington in 1983. I mean, he was ahead of his time on this issue. So the idea that they paint Bernie out to be supporting, transphobes or that he's transphobic is just an absurd smear.
What he said was that, Bernie was talking about the moral issue when he included trans folks with other oppressed minorities. But then Warren said she would have a ceremony in the Rose Garden where she would read the names of the trans women who were murdered, I guess. And so Frum says, Sanders checked a box of support for the identity issue, then returned to regular programming, meaning his major themes. For Warren, the identity issue was the regular programming. And quite frankly, people that follow me know that I've said that identity politics is dividing the left, because then you get into this thing of oppression Olympics where one person's, oppression is worse than the other person's oppression. And you have all these groups fighting each other and the right is loving it. In fact, there was a quote, I think it was Steve Bannon, who said, as long as we have them talking about, gay rights, or I should have looked up the quote before the show, but I'm going to put it in the comments. He loves it. So here is this right-wing guy trying to egg us on to keep doing that so that we will lose once again.
It's the playbook from 2016 and it's all they have. Yeah. It really is. If you look at the record on the trans issue, Bernie wins it and nobody would really debate that.
Then he starts quoting Hillary Clinton, Nobody likes him. Nobody wants to work with him. He got nothing done. He was a career politician. It's all just baloney. And I feel so bad that people got sucked into it, Hillary says in a forthcoming documentary. And then there was a panel at Sundance when apparently Jeffrey Goldberg, who is the editor for The Atlantic, was interviewing her. And by the way, he went to my college. Last summer, I saw him at our reunion. He was on a panel about the media and the election. And afterwards, I went up and I asked him a question about their coverage of Bernie, and he took such affronter. He was so affronted by the way he said it was a leading question because I was trying to put some context to my question about how they've been smearing Bernie, that he wasn't even going to deign it with an answer. He was just so presumptuous. So here you can imagine him moderating this panel when asked if she's even going to support him if he gets the nomination. She says, I'm not there yet. So instead of criticizing her for dividing the party and not trying to have unity, they make like she's the, wounded party here.
The result of that from Hillary was that Bernie probably had a record fundraising day. Immediately following that, he went up in the polls and has been, surging since. Online, I like Bernie hashtag trended for a full 24 hours. And when they released the numbers, I'm sure he had one of his best days ever. So, as much as they want to use that attack and try to divide us over people that supported Hillary in 2016, it's not working this time around.
Yeah, the other point he made was that Sanders' team is not going to be prepared for these attacks by Trump, because apparently Sanders' team is, experts in Democratic infighting. But what he doesn't acknowledge is the fact that these Democrats, or at least their surrogates on social media, are throwing all these things at us right now. And I mean people like Mendoza Ferrer, Neera Tanden, Joy Reid, Bakari Sellers, Sadie Doyle. All these people have been throwing these smears that poor little Bree Joy Gray, and Nina Turner have to deal with. I mean, they're taking the hits, and they can't even say anything without getting attacked for what they say in defense.
As bad as they are, we're winning this argument. I mean, the mainstream media has lost so much respect and so much of an audience, frankly, that, Twitter, as much as I may hate Twitter and Facebook at times, it's our biggest place to push back and debunk all these garbage narratives they throw at us. And it's working. People know the truth. I mean, enough do.
Well, one point that he made that I liked, which I think was the most of the second part of his article, was that, how does he phrase it? Woke, but...
left, but not woke.
Yeah, left, but not woke. And he says, the constellation of issues that predominates among highly online and very well-informed anti-Trump voters matter a lot less to millions of other people who could potentially decide the 2020 election. That observation applies to a lot of issues that are authentically important. Defeating corruption matters, but it's easier to concentrate on those issues when you have good health insurance and a job that provides a stable middle-class livelihood, including the possibility of a college education for your children. And too many Americans lack those things. It's a testament to the power of the Sanders approach to politics that it has elevated, and now this is a backhanded compliment here, that it has elevated as irascible and negligible a person as Bernie Sanders to the top of the Democratic pack. If the Oval Office is to be cleansed of Donald Trump, it will not suffice to defeat Sanders' candidacy. The ultimate winner will have to plagiarize from his campaign, copying not Sanders' literal ideas, God forbid, but his themes, the practical over the theoretical, the universal over the particular. I mean, it is so presumptuous and so elitist. There are many ways to divide the Democratic field: by ideology, by gender, by ethnicity, by age. But perhaps the most important is this: for Buttigieg, for Bloomberg, as for me, and very likely for you, reader of The Atlantic, one of the most decisive days of our lives was the day we received the fat envelope of acceptances from a selective educational institution. And I can relate to that because I did go to one of those elite institutions. Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, he puts Biden in here, speak to Americans for whom the fat envelope, thin envelope decision means little, if it means anything at all. It's not accident or name recognition that explains why they lead the field. They are both being carried by something big and real. The challenge for the person who will succeed in beating Trump in 2020 is not merely to ride that force, but to guide it. And I love the guide it. It's so elitist. It's so paternalistic, like with the Sanders movement, we are the movement. It's not like we're some cult just deferring to whatever Bernie wants us to do. He defers to us. Thus the slogan, not me, us.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem I have with this whole article. I mean, he's basically lobbying for someone like Bernie, not named Bernie.
Yeah. I mean, talk about plagiarism. Joe Biden lost 2 of his previous campaigns. He had to drop out because the plagiarism scandal. Isn't it funny how that plagiarism scandal has not surfaced at all with all these eagle,
right.
journalists didn't come up with a plagiarism scandal. And then they even defend like Jennifer Rubin here, she defends the Social Security thing by saying that Bernie lied about it, that he doctored a clip. Meanwhile, Ryan Grimm wrote a whole article on how Joe Biden's been trying to cut Social Security for 40 years. I mean, they just lie with impunity.
Yeah, I mean, and if your point is that they haven't vetted Bernie, wait till they vet Biden. I mean, if Biden got through the general election, there's so much to hit him on. I mean, it's endless video of, for the low information voters, let's just go to the creepy videos with them sniffing children's hair and being creepy with the kids.
Yeah.
I mean, that stuff alone is going to play very well with a lot of people.
Yeah.
I mean, play badly, but then you go to him. His closing argument before Iowa is that Sanders is lying to him, and their campaign doctored a video saying he was for Social Security cuts. Okay, that's great if there was no internet.
Yeah.
Anyone really concerned about that can Google Joe Biden and find 15 videos of him saying he'd freeze or cut Social Security. So it's a terrible argument. The idea that he hasn't been vetted, though, I mean, that Bernie hasn't been vetted and the other candidates have, is silly. I mean, look at Elizabeth Warren. There's a lot of stuff they could hit Warren on still. I mean, she never made right with the Native American community. Why don't they talk to the Native American community about how they feel about her?
Well, because they're not trying to stop her. This one was Bernie Sanders and his internet army, and they talked to a Peggy Hoopert, an Iowa activist who consulted for the Sanders campaign in 2016. And she decided to support Buttigieg, quote, in large part because of the way he conducts himself. She praised Mr. Sanders' letters to supporters after his announcement, but said that his message had plainly failed to resonate. Quote, Obama set the tone for his campaign. You are positive, you are respectful, you are civil, Ms. Hoopert said. I guess Bernie hasn't. And I find that particularly hysterical because Obama ran the most negative attack ads, basically questioning her character, calling her a liar. His attack ads were vicious, and we know that Bernie hates these personal attack ads. This ad that he ran against Biden on Social Security was totally about policy, and it was totally because he was baited into it.
Right, and it was totally Joe Biden speaking.
Yeah.
So he's removed from it. Like, here's Joe Biden's words. Have at it.
And I mean, do you think that Bernie should be doing more of these kind of ads? Because I think there's tons of things he could talk. I mean, even there's a video that I share a lot on from YouTube called Bernie versus Biden on the crime bill. And it has a clip of Biden talking about how we have to get tough on crime and don't talk to me about poverty and these poor conditions that these people come from. These people are predators.
I would like to see more of the contrast videos. I mean, I think that plays really well. You could just show Bernie on the issue, Biden on the issue, slam dunk. On the other hand, what Bernie's done so far has gotten in the lead in probably 3 out of 4 of the first early states. So Biden opened up an opening on Social Security that's going to sink him. And so, my sense strategically is just put your foot down on his neck on that issue and make that your closing argument to Iowa. Because let's face it, Biden's got a lot of older voters that care a lot about Social Security. And this is a simple issue to make the contrast on.
There's a couple of other things I wanted to pull out of that first article. In the New York Times, where they talked about the chairs being thrown. They bring that up again, and
the mystical chairs,
right? And they say which some Sanders supporters dispute. How about John Ralston, who was the reporter on that story, actually lost his PBS reporting gig over that non-story. I mean, I saw the live video. Somebody raised a chair and then promptly put it down. There was no throwing of chairs going on, Right.
And if I recall correctly, that week, that story became, central, and everyone was being asked their views on it. So even if you weren't related to the Bernie campaign, if you were on television, a pundit for one of the campaigns, how do you feel about the chair throwing incident? I mean, when I say one of the campaigns, there was only Hillary, but I mean, anyone that was a Democrat was asked about it.
Yeah.
And then they also at at that same time, we're pushing another narrative about someone getting a death threat at home, a phone call.
Roberta Lang.
Yeah, so here you are, an unverifiable, nobody knows who called. It's not a Bernie person. You can't pin it down. And we're still talking about just one person. And that's a news story.
I know. So now that we're bringing it into 2020 and they're talking about Warren, and they're making it look like Sean King started this whole thing with the snakes. He tweeted something about he had spoken to Warren campaign staff members who reported that she, quote, routinely embellishes stories. He alleged that the Warren campaign and its allies, quote, leaked this attack against Bernie to the press for political gain, unquote. Eventually, Ms. Turner, the campaign co-chair, got in touch. Quote, she called me and said, Sean just let up on it, he said. He did to an extent, but by then, much of the Sanders-allied internet was about to begin tweeting snakes at Ms. Warren and her supporters en masse. Now, again, why not, if they're reporters, why don't they follow up on these Sanders staffers, Warren staffers who call her embellishing? We know she's embellished stories before. She talked about her father being a janitor. Even her own brother called her out on that. You know, she said she was Native American on an application. She said she was fired from her job, her teaching job, because she got pregnant.
She said her kids went to public schools.
Right. Now, why aren't they?
Why are you telling that lie? Why, that's just, she has so many unforced errors on these because she's a lawyer trying to lawyer her way through this and gets tripped up trying to find appropriate answers.
And even the Washington Post, Sean Sullivan wrote that of the 4 parties who Warren told of that conversation, one of them corroborated Bernie's version of the story. And that appeared only in that one outlet, and it was never spoken of again. And yet they go on to the debate, and that Abby Phillips asked that question in such a way that caused Bernie to snicker and the audience to laugh. He denies doing it, and then she completely ignores his denial and goes to Warren. So how did you feel when, when
he said
Bernie
a woman couldn't be president, right?
It's just so unbelievable.
But again, the good news is it's so overt and obvious, and so many people have been pushing back against it that it backfires. And Warren went straight down from the debate.
Yeah.
Straight down.
Yeah. And, but there was a Twitter thread that I wanted you to comment on. And it was from a person who admittedly is a Warren community captain or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
We have victory captains, they have whatever they call them. I was thrilled to have Elizabeth Warren and Senator Sanders in the race, 2 progressives I respect. I decided to volunteer for Warren because I believe in her intersectional policies and think she's the best suited to implement them. But I'd still volunteer for Bernie if he's the nominee. Now I have reservations. After weeks of interacting with some of his supporters at a local farmer's market, and this guy does do this because his whole Twitter feed is filled with encounters at his farmer's market. We've had a number of really toxic experiences, mostly perpetuated by a few of his volunteers. Here are some of these experiences. In our first table event, one woman came up to us and yelled about how Warren doesn't support Medicare for all. We calmly showed her Warren's Medicare for All plan and talked about it, but she would not have it and continued to yell at us at our table in the middle of the market. For weeks now, the Bernie table loudly tells anyone who comes near them that Warren doesn't support Medicare for all and that Bernie is the only candidate that supports Medicare for all. That's not true. It is disheartening that fellow progressives feel the need to spread misinformation to get votes. That's what Trump does. That's not what we do. And that's exactly the theme of Jennifer Rubin's article in the Washington Post. One day, all the other tables at the farmer's market are always polite, cordial, and stick to the issues. One day, Sissy Villain, I guess that's his partner there, was explaining some Warren policy when a Bernie volunteer came up to him and flatly said, "You are just a Pocahontas lover." We were literally at a loss for words. At another day, Bernie volunteers rearranged their tent mid-market, clearly obstructing other tents in the free speech area. Market managers had to intervene and ask those volunteers to be more civil. Today, multiple Bernie volunteers were praising Joe Rogan and his endorsement of Sanders of proof that working people are with Bernie. No mention of Rogan's bigoted, regressive views. No progressive should be putting Joe Rogan up on a pedestal, period. I know there are many Bernie supporters with good hearts and who believe in progressive goals. I will always fight alongside them. But it's clear to me that the toxicity of some supporters is not just something on Twitter. It's an attitude that creeped into real life too. We need a movement that reflects our ideals. That movement shouldn't be spreading misinformation or bad faith attacks on fellow progressives. It should be a no-brainer for someone like me to volunteer for Bernie. If Liz doesn't get the nomination, the fact that it's not is a problem. So what do you want to say about that?
Well, I mean, my first thought is grow up and realize that this is a political campaign where there's a lot of confrontation. There's a lot at stake, and supporters are going to be passionate of their candidate. That's just how elections are. I mean, it's not advocated from the top. You know, if you look at all the groups, you know, of the supporters running for office, probably the most destitute support Bernie. So the most with the most at stake support Bernie, because he has, you know, I mean, we can go down the list of policies, but, you know, free college, $15 minimum wage, jobs program, healthcare. You know, if you're dying of healthcare, you're really passionate about needing Medicare for all. And so, you know, a lot of the betrayal with Warren is that she ran on basically being Bernie and then pivoted away from it. So anyway, you're going to have a lot of passionate supporters. And that's just part of an election. And, you know, never in the past was unity pitched before the primaries were over. Unity is something you do after the primaries.
Well, I don't really think that his point was unity. I think his point was civility. And that's been my point. And I've been excoriated on my own Facebook page for when people post Pocahontas memes about Elizabeth Warren. There's a strategy to do this. It's like, I want to just tell a little story and take a little bit of credit, hopefully, because I went to a fundraiser and I paid good amount of money to go to this fundraiser to meet Pramila Jayapal. And I knew that she had not endorsed Bernie yet. And people were telling me, people who know her were telling me that she was leaning Warren. And I really wanted to stave off that endorsement. And because I knew she was leaning Warren, I even knew that Warren's office was a lot more responsive to her when she was crafting her Medicare for All plan than Bernie's office was. When I talked to Pramila Jayapal, I basically said, look, I think Warren is progressive. I like all of her plans. But I think that the difference is their theory of change. Like Warren thinks that she can get things done internally because she has relationships in Congress and that's how she can make things happen. Whereas Bernie knows that any social change that has ever happened has come from grassroots movements, grassroots social movements. And he has been leading a grassroots social movement for 4 years now. She's never led one. She's never even been a part of one. She wasn't in the anti-Vietnam War movement. She wasn't in the women's movement. She wasn't in the anti-nuke movement. She didn't go to Standing Rock. She doesn't know, as we say with our Yiddish accent, she doesn't know from movements, you know? Right. So, and here's the thing. What I also told Pramila Jayapal, I didn't get into all that detail, is that Bernie Sanders supporters, to your point that you just made, are materially affected by the success of his policies, whereas Warren supporters are more comfortable. This is the point that the so-called script, you know, was trying to make. It wasn't a personal attack on Warren. It basically said that her supporters are more affluent and more highly educated. And therefore, they, like that sign at the Women's March, if Hillary were president, I'd be at brunch right now. Warren supporters, if she got elected, would go back to brunch. And that wouldn't work out at all because then she'd never get anything done. And wouldn't you know, that was exactly the rationale without using those words. But the movement candidate was how Pramila Jayapal justified her endorsement of Bernie.
My first thought on that person's, the Warren supporters, that thread is, at no point would I condone using Pocahontas or any of those angles. But I think it's fair game to criticize her on Medicare for All. And I also really don't like civility arguments. I think you've got a lot of mad people, and hiding the anger is not necessarily a good thing. I think we need it. I mean, you know, Bernie is the guy running the campaign. You know, Bernie needs to have the civility. Bernie needs to give the right positive messages. Bernie needs to do that. We don't. We are mad citizens fighting a government that doesn't represent us, a government that would have policies written by corporations instead of, you know, people, trade deals that favor pollution instead of the environment. You know, we should be mad. So I really don't care about tone policing people other than don't be sexist, don't be racist, don't say things. But if you want to give the bird to somebody because you're so pissed off, well, that's your voice. You know, I'm for that.
Well, I guess it depends on what you're doing. You know, if you're trying to like it, I would maybe talk more about Bernie like that to be, if you have somebody come up to your booth and you're trying to
Yeah, of course. I mean, if you're,
say, you know, I've got all this student debt and, you know, the banks,
right,
you
of
can
course, but
when you're talking to a Warren supporter or somebody who's on the fence, I don't think it would it helps to go negative.
Of course. But see, that's where, like you said, it depends on what you're doing. If you're canvassing, you're not spreading negativity about other candidates. You know, that's not how you canvass. But if you're on Twitter and you're mad, well, you don't have to be, you're not a representative of Bernie on Twitter.
Yeah.
You're a citizen voicing your anger. And if everybody just acted like we're a nice canvasser trying to win people over with our friendly words, the movement wouldn't have what it needs. You need to have everything. You need the angry people. You need the friendly people. You need the people that really hate Warren to their bones. You need the people that can't stand Biden. You need all of it. So, you know, just because I feel a certain way about how I'm going to react with other people, I don't ever discount how somebody else acts. Just, you know, if the one thing is don't be sexist, racist, homophobe, you know, the obvious stuff, but be angry, your anger level, how you deal with people. You know, if you're trying to win people over, it might not work what you're doing, but your voice needs to be out there too.
Yeah. I personally do think that Elizabeth Warren supports Medicare for all. I think that she's never going to get it in the way, I think she's being disingenuous when she tells me she's going to start with a public option and then 3 years down the road, she's going to switch over to Medicare for all. We know how difficult it's going to be to get a public option, and we don't even want a public option because what's going to happen is all the sickest people are going to go into it and it's going to collapse under its own weight, and everybody's going to say, see what I told you about that government-run healthcare?
Well, it's the poison pill. It's you know, you're going to have a plan that people get on. It doesn't have all the cost savings of the scale of the Medicare for all would have. So it's not going to reduce the cost like it should. And then 3 years later, you're going to vote on it. And then, you know, obviously it didn't work as well as they wanted it to. I mean, look what they did with Obamacare. When they pulled the funding from some states, Obamacare would have been more successful if Republican governors had accepted the money for Obamacare. You know, but they undermined it. And of course, they would do the same thing with the short-term program, a trial program for Medicare for all. So it is built to fail. And her trust in the system, if you take her at her word and you believe she has integrity and thinks this is the best plan, it's still a plan that's going to fail. So it is a structural system and structural mindset of how Bernie approaches the problem. Bernie says we have to get it all. And that's our starting position, at least.
Yeah.
And you know, we do that through a movement of people forcing people essentially to make these changes. You know, when Bernie gets into office, when Medicare for all comes up, it's going to be really hard to be a Democrat against Medicare for all. And, you know, under Bernie. Now, if Warren got the presidency, Democrats get away with voting against Medicare for all. Yeah. She doesn't have the force to put the pressure on these people to support it. She just doesn't.
Yeah. And also, she doesn't have the commitment. It wasn't her signature issue. Her signature issue was the banks and corruption. And when you know, in the early days, when she talked about what the first three things she was going to do were, Medicare for all was definitely not one of them. So, you know, you can say these things. Also, you can say, look, she goes to her rallies. Nobody's asking her questions about Medicare for all, probably because they're happy with their employer insurance, whatever. And she's being responsive to her constituents. But, it just is more evidence that she has a different base than Bernie's base. Bernie's base are people that are dying from lack of health insurance. 45,000 Americans die from lack of health insurance every year. I heard Obamacare referred to the other day as private health insurance for all. And I love that, because I always talked about it as it was the only thing where they forced you to buy a private product that you can't afford to use. So it's like AOC said in her speech the other day, if I wasn't spending $500 a month on my insurance, I could actually spend it on my health care, right? I'm like, oh my God, I got to quote that. And so brilliant.
But that's what it comes down to with a lot of Warren's policies. She has faith in a capitalist solution to the climate crisis, and it's just not going to happen. We've seen that. You can't have, our government is so corrupt, and the politicians are so beholden to the donor money that if they have a seat at the table, it's not going to work, whatever the issue is.
Yeah.
The insurance companies, the corporations that don't want to buy into the Green New Deal, you can't have them negotiating the Green New Deal.
And ultimately, I think that's, to bring us back to where we started this show, that is ultimately what these media corporations have against Bernie Sanders, is he's not only taking them on and wanting to break them up, but he's taking on all their advertisers as well. So it's a complete disruption to their business model and their big CEO salaries and their comfortable way of life. I mean, I posted that if you want to understand why they're going after Bernie so hard, why CNN did it right after the debate. I found an article from 2 years ago basically saying he is leading the charge to try to stop the merger of AT&T and Time Warner, which actually went through. But, and then, of course, recently he praised the National Labor Relations Board's decision to award the CNN employees $76 million of back pay. Anything else you want to have? Last word there, Pat?
No, I'm just rooting for Iowa. I think we're in good shape. We couldn't be in a better position a week before it. I wouldn't have thought we would be here surging. So keep calling, phone banking, text banking, canvassing, work our butts off, and we're doing okay.
I mean, if this ends up being a brokered convention, this is going to be even more exciting than the last one that I was at as a delegate. So
fingers crossed we're not there, but yeah.
All right. Well, I'm going to say goodbye now and stay tuned. And if this is the first time you've seen me, I do my show fairly regularly, although I was on hiatus for about 6 weeks from being in Facebook jail. But now that I'm in Facebook jail for 3 months, I can't just wait that out. So I'm going to keep doing my show regularly, but not with any specific schedule. But you can always check my YouTube channel. Like I end all my shows after I thank my guest, I say, keep fighting. And I did not steal that from Lee Camp. I found out that he used it after a year of my using it. So he said I could keep using it. So I do want everybody to keep fighting. Good night.
All right. Night.